Good afternoon and welcome back to the Audiokinetic Theater. It's now time to do the Somerville audio deep dive with Matteo and Jay from Jumpship, right?
Yeah, and I'm from Swedish Tech now, but yes, I was a
Switch
jump.
Tech and Jumpship.
That's right.
Take us away.
Cool. So, hi, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming along. Yeah, we're going to talk about Somerville, and we're going to do a deep dive into how we implemented that audio in Wise today. So, first, some introduction. Matteo.
Hello, my name is Matteo Cerquone. I'm the audio director, one of the composer for the game Somerville.
And I'm Jay. I was audio programmer for Jumpship on Somerville, and I'm now tech director of Swedish Tech, which is part of Sweet Justice Sound. We make modular audio middleware, but right now we're going to be talking about Somerville. So yeah, do you want to say what Somerville is in case anyone didn't get a chance to play?
Yeah, of course. So for those who don't know, Somerville is a sci-fi adventure game which is grounded into the intimate repercussion of a large-scale conflict, or at least that's what we wrote on our Steam page. It's available on Xbox, PC, and PlayStation.
Really honored to be nominated for a Dice Award in 2023, which, yeah, we didn't win that year because it was God of War's year, of course, but it's just amazing to be up there with that kind of thing. So yeah, we're really pleased with that, and we just want to share kind of how we achieved that. So we're going to split this talk today into a little presentation about how we did certain things in the game, and then we're going to spend some time in the Wise session as well, digging through, and Matteo's going to show how it's implemented there. So first, we're going to talk about beams and environments. We're going to talk about the cinematic mix and how we achieved that. We're going to go into the sediment and the monolith. They're the kind of creaturey parts of the game. We're going to talk a little bit about breathing in our characters, and then we're going to round up with the powers that they have. So yeah, to start off with, we're going to talk about environments. So we had a system called audio environments, which were the technical backbone of our ambient system. So fundamentally, they are built for playing an ambient bed sound when a listener is within a roll-off distance of a spatial volume, which in Somerville's code base, which was in Unity, we call these zones. We didn't end up using the built-in trigger system. We just used our own code. And then we faded a sound up between the edge of the roll-off of that defined shape. And this is a fade over distance that we had in this little green area here. So we didn't fade over time. You get a much more responsive and interactive effect from that. So when we were trying to implement this, we encountered this immediate issue in that Wise's attenuation is based on point sources and can't easily be applied to volumes. So we wanted to be able to fake an area volume. So instead of using attenuation, we actually passed a relevance value through an RTPC from 0 to 1, which could then be used on the Wise side to smoothly fade in the ambient bed as the player gets closer to the boundary of the sound. It could then be used for other things as well, so global RTPCs could be affected by specific audio environments, which is really useful.
Yeah, it was actually very useful because we ended up creating like big area shapes that cover like the big part of the game, which contains all the different ambiances that you can find in the area, and then we would create other audio area shapes which will then remix all those ambiances in real time, so you never actually hear them all at the same time.
Do we have any math nerds? Okay, so this is a Minkowski sum of a sphere that's the shape of the roll-off distance and that defined shape that we did. So yeah, that's a really awesome thing. Just look it up. I love a Minkowski sum. They're not popular enough. So yeah, we also use these things to set states for mixing and for the music system. And we also use them to set reverb sends using the game-defined sends. So we ended up using a large number of different impulse responses in Somerville. I think we settled on about 15 on different buses to achieve the sonic sense of place that we wanted to in Somerville. And then the sound designers could choose which of them are used via an in-Unity switch dropdown, and they could be blended together using the audio environment zones. So when we first built these audio environments, we built a priority system within that for the sounds, so that manually set priority on these things would cause a more important audio environment to duck the sound of a less important one. But actually, in practice, we found that we didn't need that from an artistic point of view. We generally didn't have that many of these things playing. However, because of the limitation on 4 user-defined sends, or sorry, game-defined sends in Wise, and that I guess is to prevent CPU difficulties and cost explosions, we ended up using this prioritization system that we built to make sure only the 4 most important or relevant impulse responses are applied to any given sound. So this also helped with mix clarity, because you really probably don't want more than 4 IRs at any given time. And so, yeah, this was a good bit of technical reuse of some stuff that we made for something else, ended up using and applying to another way. It's always good to do that, especially in a tight production schedule. Yeah, and in terms of shapes for altering these ambiances, we made use of two different types of zones for audio environments. We had just simple boxes, like you're probably used to using from any given game engine. And we also made this polygon shape, which is just defined as a 2D polygon and then given a height that's the same across the whole thing. Yeah, these two types were basically enough to cover the whole game. And yeah, we've got a video. Is there something in the Soundcaster session to dive into yet?
There is, yeah.
Okay, yeah, do you want to do that
There is a little bit. Yes, of course. How difficult it is to click right from this position. But yeah, so pretty much like as you can see here, like we got one event which triggers an entire sets of different sounds that are all combined here. So basically, what we're actually doing is within every object in here, we have all different kind of artifices, which are just like the environment indoor, for example. So depending if we are inside or outside the house, those actually bring the sounds up and down for some of those. I haven't opened the session in a whole lot of time, but basically what's going on, we can play all the different sounds at once in the same level, and then depending if we are indoor, we have certain sounds going up and down in volume, but also if we are, for example, in the mixed basement, we do other certain things. For example, like we can bring some sounds for when we are in the basement, so when we are outside the basement, and it's also used there for like faking occlusion in a lot of different areas. I'm sure we can have some other better example, but in order for not taking away too much time, we can carry on with the next section of
Sure.
the talk.
So yeah, should we play that video quickly as well?
Oh yeah,
it looks like
absolutely.
from Unity.
This might be a very subtle change, but like as we see in the editor, like the big white box, pretty much it's a way for remixing the sound around the game. So when the character gets very close to the phone line, we just like duck down all the ambiances and we just bring up the sounds of that line phone just to kind of give a bit of a remix over time. And all those sorts of like mixed snapshots, they are pretty much scattered around all the different levels. So we always remix all the sounds depending on where our character is in this case. And let's talk a little bit about some monolith beams.
It's almost as bad as that bomb cyclone that hit San Francisco last year. Yeah, sorry, please go on.
Go for it. So yeah, so as we have those purple monolith beams that sweep across the map, we wanted objects in the world to interact with them. And this was in order to give a sense of urgency to alert the player of the incoming danger. And also to help driving the player towards safe zones and take over. So what we did was placing a few audio objects in the map, and then we would create components that we could attach to a few of these objects. And such component would then take in consideration the distance between the beam threshold and the component itself. So these values will then be sent to an RTPC so that we can modulate them over time. And we can actually, I think we have a video here, but we can also look in through Wwise. They can be a good example. All right, thank you. So yeah, I'm gonna switch to Wise real quick, and we can actually, let's see. So we have this RTPC, which are the boundaries, so how close the beam is to the main character. And as the beam swipes across and gets further away, obviously, like all the sounds get turned off quite a bit. So there is all different sounds that are placed into this blank container. I think along with some of the sounds, we have things such as the chatter. See if we can hear some of that. Can you all hear good from there? So now, what is quite interesting about this part over there is that we can actually read all different kind of parameters. So one of them is, of course, the boundary attenuation, as we talked earlier, but it's also the speed of how fast is the APC moving, so that purple beam. So we try to make something that is as interactive as possible. So there isn't like a one-shot sounds, but they're all based into using different loops that play at the same time. And then we just use different RTPCs that are driven by the game to actually make things more interactive as possible. And along with that, we also have the chatter meter. So basically, if I unmute all this, so basically, one thing we wanted to do that as the purple beam moves across, so as it starts moving, we start hearing more of the chatter of this beam. And basically, we are metering that so that we can turn down all the other sounds around the level. So it's always a good way to do some interactive duck mixing.
So yeah, that kind of rounds up our ambiences and environments and the beams. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how we achieved our cinematic mix in the game.
So yeah, first of all, we started by implementing audio using the native tools from Unity and Wise, but we didn't get like some really good results at the beginning. So the audio experience and the mix was quite inconsistent, and at times it was also noisy and confusing for the player. But in order to explain why that was the case for our game, we need to talk a little bit about cameras. So the camera in Somerville, they don't have a fixed behavior, but they always change on a case-by-case scenario. So that it's usually chosen by the director. So for example, we have cameras that are on a fixed position, and you can think of them as being on tripods, where the rotation is the only movement allowed. And in most of those cases, like moving from one area to another happens with a quick cut or a quick transition. And also we have cameras that move on rails. You can also think of them as dolly shots. In a lot of cases, it gives a feeling of playing a side-scroller game. But they're also used for other effects, such as moving through objects, like in this case over here. And lastly, we also have cameras that are completely free from movement. So you can think of them as a similar approach to playing a third-person game. Yeah. And it was mostly used on the early stage of development. So with all of those different cameras, each one of these settings can also blend and transition between each other seamlessly. And it's all based on a distance and location from the main character to the different camera zones. So with all those different behaviors and the way the camera always moves and changes over time, it begs the question on who is the listener in Somerville. And for those who are not familiar, the listener is what emulates the distance and position of audio sources in the game, so and drives volumes, attenuations, panning, reverb, occlusion, and so on. In a few words, they can be considered as our virtual ears in a 3D environment. So in first-person games, usually the audio listener is placed on the camera itself, so that if someone, for example, is shooting on your right, that's not on your screen, you can just turn around, I can pinpoint what it is, because it's going to play in your right speaker. If it's far away, there's going to be applied more reverb and filtering and so on. So first of all, we try to place the listener on the main character on screen, and that made, obviously, like objects sound louder based on the distance between the main character and the object emitting the sound. Now, this was an issue mostly in areas where we had cameras stuck into a fixed position, while the main character is moving around the screen, or in other areas where the main character is far away, like in this example here. And if you're wondering where our main character is right there. So of course, in this example, any objects that would be close to the player will sound very up close and very loud, even though we can see that it's, that it's very far in the distance. And there's a little bit of an example on how it sounded back then. You will notice that sounds will get louder depending on the distance between the toddler, our main character in this case, and the object emitting the sound. Can you bump up a little bit?
Yeah, thanks.
So yeah, the next attempt was to place the listener onto the camera itself. So now, of course, that meant that volumes are driven by the distance between the camera and the emitter. Now, what we found was that the camera in Somerville make use of different lenses with different fields of view. So for example, on those two screenshots over here, we can perceive that the character is pretty much at the same distance since they seem to appear to occupy pretty much the same size of screen. But if we look at it from the editor on top-down view, we can actually uncover that the camera on the right side, on the right screenshots, is much closer. So, of course, this meant that at times, even though a camera was placed in a certain distance, a specific set of lenses will make objects appear much closer or further away. So, of course, they created a lot of inconsistencies with audio across the whole game, and sounds would sound, some object would sound very loud, even though they seem to be far away or very close. So with this very last try, it became quite clear for us that we had to take a little bit of a step back, and then we had to look at one of our audio direction pillar, which was to try and make it sound like a movie. So, but what does it mean? So in movies, there are not fixed listeners, but everything is hand placed by the sound designer on the mixer. So all the sounds are handcrafted, and audio mixes are driven by storytelling decisions. So basically, sounds are not always the loudest based on their position on screen. So with that in mind, we had to change the approach when designing and implementing audio. So we started by using a more linear approach. First of all, we will take a video of a playthrough, and then we will bring it into our DAW choice, which in our case, it's Reaper. And then we would edit the sound there and spend some time doing a mix pass, and overall designing the sonic soundscape completely freely from confinement that are dictated by game engine. We will then do a full breakdown and analyze how the soundscape will change depending on what is going on screen.
And then we'd usually jump on a call together because we were all working remote at this point. We would jump on a call and discuss how the ways it could be implemented. And then if we thought it needed a new audio feature, which it often did, I would try to break those things down into things that could be in addition to an existing audio system that we had, or whether a completely new system was needed. And to be honest, it often was. So then I'd take a first crack at implementing that on the code side, while Matteo created some rough out data in Wwise that I could plug into it. When we brought these two things together and I tried to plug that data into the code, I'd find out that it wasn't supposed to work like that, and I'd need to go back and start completely from scratch again. But at least we'd have achieved clarity about what it was that was wanted from the system and could build it right. So then I would check the first implementation into the game and hand over to Matteo, who could implement more instances of the system if necessary. So some systems we had were just complete one-offs in the game, and we only had one instance, and some had up like hundreds and hundreds across the game. So it was a complete balance and really different depending on what the features were. And then we would just iterate until over and over again until we run out of time and the game had to ship. Yeah. So stepping back to the problem that we were trying to solve with this, the first time we used that system process was to solve the which do we have, a camera listener or a player listener? And we decided, why not both? We wanted sound designers to be able to select which listener applies attenuation to a given sound. So we built a system within the Somerville audio in Unity to have one listener fixed to the player at around chest height, and that listener is always facing the way the camera is looking. And then we had another listener fixed to the camera, obviously always facing the same direction as the camera there. We kept the player listener fixed facing the same direction as the camera to prevent the mix changing rapidly if the player like spins in a circle or changes back and forward. We didn't want the focus controls messing things up in that case. So on the code side, Wwise assigns a default listener to every audio object, which in our case was the player listener. But it also gives you the option to override a listener in code. So we wrapped up the functionality to do that into a drop-down box in Unity that sound designers could just select which listener we had. So you could choose to override it with the camera. We'd also remove the default player listener at that point, so you didn't get a weird doubling signal flow. We had a bug with that for a while, and it was two listeners at once. And it was horrible. Don't let yourself get into that.
Everything sounded double louder. Yeah.
Yeah, so here's a quick video showing how reverb and ambiances are affected by different listeners when the character goes into the fridge. Hear the reverb change. And the camera listener drives the ambience. So yeah, it was quite subtle. You wouldn't necessarily notice it when you're playing the game, but that's good. So yeah, along with the dual listener system, we found that we needed some extra mix controls for sounds to feel like they responded cinematically. So usually you'd mix a sound's cone attenuation or like directional attenuation based on its local forward direction, as if that sound were a loudspeaker in the scene, so turning it in different angles would sound differently. But we also found we needed to mix sounds based on the listener's forward direction, as if that listener were like a cardioid microphone in the scene and you were turning it around and getting off-axis response. So at the time, Wwise didn't have built-in listener relative parameters like that, although I believe they are now implemented in Wwise. I'm not 100% sure. We're on an older version of Wwise when we ship this game. So anyway, in any case, we needed to add them, and we found that it was best to split the angle between the listener and the emitter up into an azimuth angle, which is the flat angle between the listener forward, which is up there, and the listener to emitter direction. So that angle is that like red line there on that isometric tilted view of how it looks. And then we also have the elevation, which is how high above the flat plane that azimuth angle creates the emitter is. So to calculate azimuth, it's the angle around the world up vector between the way the listener is facing and the direction from the listener to the emitter. And then here's a side-on view of how elevation is calculated. It's much simpler. It's just taking the arc cosine of the y component of the direction of the vector from the listener to the emitter. So it's simple, you know. It can be a bit awkward to visualize as well. So we implemented some debug displays that basically show you in the red angle there is the elevation. The emitter is the TV in this case, and the listener is kind of at the center of the circle. And the green section is the azimuth. And we also drew the flat plane to make it clear where the planar thing is. But yeah, here's an example of it being used to attenuate the TV. Okay. So we also had a lot of room-based soundscapes in Somerville. So we, in theory, the Wwise spatial audio plugin would have been great for us. But so we tried it out a lot. But we found in practice it was a bit more first-person focused, and we couldn't get the results we wanted while we still we had this two different listener perspectives. I think at the time spatial audio only allowed for one. It may have been expanded. I'm not actually sure. But yeah, it's kind of more first-person focused. So instead of using that, we made use of camera mix value RTPCs. So we were using Cinemachine package in Unity for our camera system, and this allows you to blend cameras, as Matteo mentioned. You use blend values between 0 and 1 for them, and we just took this value, passed it through to Wwise, and used that to mix the scenes as well.
So yeah, just similar to we did with the audio environments, this also allowed us to place most of the environmental audio into the overall level. And then we will use the camera RTPC to drive the mix for each single room or location, as well as faking occlusion in a lot of different places. So it's very similar to how we did with the audio environments, but this time we just, the camera was deciding all of those parameters for us. And here is a little video.
So when dealing with the camera listener specifically, we quickly found that distance should not be the only thing driving a mix. So Somerville has a lot of different camera shot styles, as Matteo mentioned earlier, which have different lenses, which means different fields of view on the screen. So we found that wide-angle camera lenses could have characters and objects relatively close to the camera and appear somewhat small on screen, whereas narrow-angle close-up lenses could have characters and objects far in the distance but appear absolutely huge on the screen. So the mix ended up being inconsistent with the visuals in those cases. To get around this, we sent a size on-screen normalized value RTPC to Wwise to help cinematic mixing for sound objects that appeared in multiple scenes where those scenes had different camera lenses. So we actually ended up using the height coefficient of an object on the screen because it was the best proxy we found for perceived size than like the width or a diagonal one or something. And it was simpler than calculating the area that thing took up because, resolutions can change, things like that.
Yep, so we use this tool again to fake our 3D perspective. So for example, we use this all over our character for the Foley and for the breeding. So that means the reverbs, volumes, and so on, the filtering was all driven by how big the character appeared to be on screen, even though so all the sounds were set to be 2D, but we faked the 3D perspective using this method.
And yeah, finally, to fully realize that cinematic mix, we needed to know when something is in shot, i.e. whether it's on screen, and also how on screen that is, so whether it's more towards the middle or more towards the edge, to help us focus in on things that are not like peripheral to the cinematic thing. So, for example, in this top-down view, if you were just to use distance attenuation, the red square sound would be as loud as the green triangle sound, even though it's not at all in the camera shot. This would be fine in an FPS game, for example, because you want to know when things are near you and off-screen. But it's not important in a cinematic mix in this game, as there are very few things off-screen that really need that much focus that you need to know about. So we define for a given sound a safe zone on the screen in screen space, where the RTPC value is going to be 1, and then that value interpolates to 0 at the edge of the screen. So this allowed us to apply additional attenuations to sounds that are not in shot or are starting to become more peripheral. So, yeah. And here's a quick example of it going all the way to negative infinity outside of the zone. Safe zone towards the edge of the screen. It's the phone receiver. Yeah, all those things together helped us craft our cinematic mix.
Indeed it did.
And yeah, let's talk a bit about the sediment and the monolith now.
So yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about sound design, maybe. But basically, I use a lot of different sources that you can find on a grocery store. So, for example, things such as cabbage, chard, fennel, flour, oranges, peppers, rice crackers, rotten wood, rubber, and cellophane. And we put it up in our dough choice, record it, process it, and we cooked it up real good, and we ended up having some nice alien sounds. So we're going to play a little clip with how those sound sources have been used, and then we talk a little bit how they've been implemented. So yeah, so let's talk a little bit how some of the sounds were implemented in the game. So starting with the sediment. So one of the core gameplay mechanics is the ability to liquefy and solidify an alien substance that we call the sediment. And the rate on how fast it's melting depends on the strength of the light source that we have at our hand and the distance between that and the sediment itself. So in Wwise, we use a blank container with different layers of audio assets, which are the recordings that we talked earlier. So we use only one RTPC to drive those volumes, the volumes of those different recordings, pitch as well, the filters, and so on. It sounded quite horrible that we called it a gross machine. We have a Wwise session here, but for stopping me to feel like I'm a DJ at its first gig, I'm just gonna play a video of it.
It also so happened that I wrote the gameplay system that allowed the player to melt sediment, and this uses voxels and raycasting from a light source. So there's an article about it on the Somerville Steen page if you are interested to know more, so go check that out. But this meant that we could make the most of the voxel melting by adding hooks that notify you when sediment is being melted, and that could be then used by audio to drive this RTPC. So sediment audio, we tried to implement it, but we found that it had a problem in that, again, it's area sources rather than point sources, a bit like the audio environment. So the default point source attenuation doesn't really work. Like the center could be a long way away from the listener, even though you're right next to the melting. Or it might be inside a voxel that doesn't have any fill or isn't being melted, for example. So this was especially the case in some sediment chunks that were huge compared to the player, including that tunnel you have to melt through that we showed in one of those examples. So to get around this, we used a feature of Wwise called multi-emitter game objects. So the example that Wwise give for this is torches all burning in a dungeon and all playing on the same sound on the same game object to save CPU on a mobile platform. But we kind of turned that on its head and like nitro-charged the system a little bit. So we supplied the position of each voxel whose sediment fill amount is changing as the position of an emitter in that multi-emitter point cloud, and then Wwise's attenuation is applied to that, or the closest one of those, which sounds kind of the same as an area source. So as sediment voxels get melted away or stop melting, they stop being part of the point cloud, so the sound's attenuation field changes naturally based on that. And it was a pretty simple solution that made a creative reuse of one of Wwise's perhaps lesser used spatialization systems. And again, for those interested in the maths, it's a Minkowski sum again. Hey. So yeah, the stalkers are all procedurally rendered and animated, so we were unable to use animation tagging for them. We had to rely on procedural Foley techniques for generating the sound. So we measured their angular velocity of their heads and things like that. The stalkers' walking animations were also procedurally generated using raycast, so we had to tag into the raycast hits using the animation cycles that were procedurally generated as well. It was a lot. But also on top of this, we just had to cheat sometimes and use pre-baked scripted sound sequences where we needed those cinematic sequences to really pop. So yeah, here's a couple of examples. And yeah, the drones were these cute little rolly things that follow you around in the game. They were all procedurally rendered and animated too. So we had to, basically, we had the same restriction. We couldn't anim tag them. We had to procedurally generate all of their sound playbacks as well. So we did much the same thing as we did with the stalkers. We also had a rolling sound for when they're moving. So we just measured the angular speed of their body when they were doing that. And also, as a little aside, when the drones are eating sediment, we just use the Wwise sine generator to generate a sine tone with a slight pitch offset for each drone. And Initially, we just wanted that to be there to differentiate them, but they usually all cluster around some sediment and eat it all at once, and it ended up with some nice frequency beating that we thought sounded cool, and then we kind of, I guess we ran out of time to make a better sound for it, so it ended up shipping in the game.
It was one of those placeholder sounds that we just made it at the end to the game.
God bless happy absence, yeah. And this is a quick example of what they sound like. You can get so much variation out of loops with procedurally driven envelopes, can't you? That's like the absolute cornerstone.
Because also you can also use RTPC to modulate each other. So for example, with the head movement rotations, I was able also to turn down the volumes when, even if the drone is moving his head, but is also going at a certain speed. So they also created like a lot of, make them feel more interesting and like more smarter than what it is. Well, at the end, it's just like two real-time parameters at the end.
Wanted to talk a little bit about breathing as well, because our human characters do have to breathe. So, this is a big part of the performance of the character in the game, isn't it?
Yeah, so we should first also thank Christopher Tester and Ali Murphy for the breathing life into our character, as they are the only two actors who recorded themselves in their home. So they went recording themselves breathing while running at different speeds. So they went from not being tired to be completely out of breath. We then chopped each single breath in and breath out, and we have to categorize them in Wwise for level of tiredness, type of action that's being performed. So if they're running, walking, standing still, if they're vaulting or doing any other sort of actions, and also for the type of the motion, because the character can be relaxed, it can be scared, hurt, or also being chased.
So in terms of how we implemented this, the characters use a breath sequencer, which makes use of the Wwise callback system to know when a sound is finished. So on the code side, we track whether an inhalation or an exhalation is taking place. And then this is communicated to Wwise using a switch and a single event, which just fires over when a breath is taking place. This allows a switch container to change over in Wwise and play back an inhale or exhale something from the container hierarchy. So the sequencer also, we also allowed specific event interruptions to come from an animation trigger. So for example, when John is landing from a fall, a big oof plays. The sequencer then resets after this, because if you're exhaling and you breathe all of your air out, you would not breathe out again after that, because you just run out of air in your lungs. So we always inhaled after this happened. Breathing can also pause, mainly when the character is underwater, because they obviously can't breathe there, but it can also be forced to pause by other things in the game as well. We implemented tiredness as an RTPC based on how fast the character is running and how fast they can run in a given scene. So it holds at lower levels when there are slower max speeds for the character, so you don't end up getting like big heaving breaths when they're just going for a light jog or a walk or something. And we just implemented emotions as a switch, which was driven by zones as the character moved in and out of them. So this allowed us to enhance the character performance even more and make them sound scared, relieved, exhausted, ill, or whatever, based on what the narrative moment was doing in the game. And here's a quick example of John running up and down a hill. John's the main character, sorry. Can you hear that? And we were also additionally, and I think this really sold the effect, we were able to work with the animation team to split breath cycles into a separate animation layer. And this was driven by progress through the breath sounds. So shout out to Sarah North and Louise Malinowski at Jumpship for working with me on this to get it implemented. So every time a breath sequencer event starts, we get a callback from Wwise with the length of the sample, which allowed us to then create a normalized value of progress through that sample and send it to Unity's animator component. This meant that fast panting breaths and slow relaxed breaths all ended up syncing up perfectly with the animation. And we only used a single animation overlay layer for that and a couple of different animations, which is amazing.
Yes, and
sorry.
Oh, no. For the character's clothing falling, we took a procedural approach of detecting the relative velocity of the arm and elbow bones to the hip bone. And then we send that information to an RTPC to Wise. We then will drive the attenuations and the texture of the clothing foley sounds. And it also freed us a lot from having to tag each single animations. And we also use that wetness RTPC parameters to switch between clothing and swimming, as well as blending dried footsteps from wet footsteps. So this wetness RTPC would also interpolate over time after John, our character, gets out of the water to simulate drying over time.
Yeah, if you want to ask some questions, do we have time for questions as well? Anyway, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Jay and Matteo. Yeah.